Hi everyone. Let's look at the respiratory membrane and see how it functions. So basically a respiratory membrane consists of the alveoli, which is a single layer of epithelial tissue called simple squamous epithelium, the basement membrane, which is areolar connective tissue, and then the capillary wall. And the capillary also is simple squamous epithelium. So both layers of simple squamous epithelium share one basement membrane of areolar connective tissue. And the function is to allow for gas exchange. So here's that membrane. Here we have the simple squamous epithelial layer of the blood vessel of the capillary. Here we have the simple squamous epithelium of the alveoli. And here we have the basement membrane, the single layer of areolar connective tissue. So that entire structure is the respiratory membrane. And gases exchange associated with the different uh, amounts on each side. So if you have more oxygen in the alveoli, oxygen diffuses into the blood. If you have more carbon dioxide in the blood, it's going to diffuse out, but also associated with pressure differences, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The respiratory membrane also has specialized cells that protect, and so those are called macrophages. And then they have certain cells that produce a kind of lipid-based material called surfactant, kind of like a dish soap. And so here we have the macrophages. What the macrophages do is they wander around looking for any materials that have been inhaled that should not be there. So these macrophages then will eat up that material, any damaged cells, as well as any dust that gets in, pollen grains, or potential pathogens. And these green structures here are what we call the surfactant secreting cells. So surfactant is a lipid-based molecule, and it functions to keep the alveoli open. So alveoli are super thin, one single layer of epithelium. So if the alveoli were to fold in on itself, it'd be like having two thin layers of epithelium attached. And so have you ever had paper that got wet, say it went through the washer? And so you have this paper that's folded up and it's wet, and now you can't get it unfolded because if you do, the paper will start to rip. Well, what this surfactant does, it's like a lipid, or it's like a dish soap, and it keeps those layers, those different parts of the paper from sticking together so that you can open the paper back up. And in this case, you can keep the alveoli from collapsing in on themselves and staying stuck together. So now we're going to get into actual breathing and what's going on. So the 4 steps, the major function of the respiratory system is to get oxygen into the body and dispose of any waste products like carbon dioxide. There's other functions to the respiratory system, but this is the major function. And so we're going to talk about that right now. There are 4 steps to respiration. There's pulmonary ventilation, which is just breathing. External respiration, which is gas exchange from the alveoli to the blood. Gas transport, where we're moving the gases through the blood to the different tissue areas. And then internal respiration, where we have gas exchange from the blood to our cells. And so I found this figure on flowfinders.edu.au. I could not, I don't know why, I could not get their website URL because every time I tried to click on it, it didn't go up. But I still gave you that at least. So now you can kind of look for it. Just put that into Google Images and this picture should pop up at least. So there are 4 steps to respiration. The first step is this pulmonary ventilation. So that's basically just breathing. There's 2 parts to it. We have inspiration where we're taking air in and expiration where the air goes back out. Okay, so air goes in and a lot of the air, think about the, well, you may not know this, but I'm telling you now. Air is composed of multiple gases. The most common is actually nitrogen, but about 21% of air is oxygen. So when we breathe air in, oxygen becomes very common in our lungs, and it's not as common in our blood. The second step is external respiration. So this is where we exchange the oxygen that's found in our lungs with the carbon dioxide that's found in our blood. So there's more oxygen in our lungs, so oxygen diffuses down its concentration gradient into our blood. There's more carbon dioxide in the blood, so carbon dioxide diffuses down its concentration gradient and moves into our lungs. The third step is gas transport. Hold on, there we go. So gas transport. So our blood then transports these gases to our cells, and blood transports these gases to our lungs. So gas transport is occurring on both sides. The fourth step is internal respiration. This is where we exchange oxygen that's found in our blood for the carbon dioxide that's found in our cells. So oxygen diffuses down its concentration gradient into our cells. Carbon dioxide diffuses down its concentration gradient into our blood. And so pulmonary ventilation is a mechanical process, and it's an active process in general. The changes in our lung or our thoracic cavity allows there to be changes in the volume of our lungs. And so air is going to move into our lungs when our thoracic cavity gets larger and there's less pressure on our lungs. Once the pressure of the thoracic cavity gets small or gets higher than atmospheric pressure, air moves out. And so I found this picture at this website. I was looking on Google Images and I like this picture. So there's 2 basic phases, inspiration and expiration, which I told you before. Inspiration is breathing in air. And so this is an active process. During this process, the diaphragm has to contract and move down towards the abdominal cavity. And your external intercostals are going to also contract and move outwards. This allows your lung cavity or your thoracic cavity to get larger. That decreases the pressure. And so air moves down a pressure gradient from higher pressure in the atmosphere into the lungs, which is lower pressure. Exhalation then, air leaving the lungs, is more of a passive process. So during exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes and the external intercostals relax. This decreases the thoracic cavity size and increases the pressure in the thoracic cavity. This increased pressure here causes air to leave because there's more pressure in the thoracic cavity or in the lungs than there is in the atmosphere, and so air leaves. So the 2 major muscles of inspiration, the diaphragm is your primary mover of inspiration, and then external intercostals help with inhalation. When they contract, interpulmonary pressure or volume, not interpulmonary volume increases, and that gas pressure decreases. So air flows into the lungs. And so that's what this is showing. The thoracic cavity opens, the diaphragm moves down, so gas can move into the lungs. And here you can see interpulmonary. So during inspiration, we have more or we have less pressure in our lungs, And so we actually can pull air in. But during expiration, we have a higher atmospheric pressure, or we have a higher, I'm sorry, lung pressure, and atmospheric pressure is lower, and so air moves out. Just like I said before, expiration is a very passive process. Intrapulmonary volume is going to decrease, and this forces the air that's in our lungs out because now you have a higher pressure in the lungs than you do in the atmosphere, and so air moves out. It's all about pressure differences. Intrapleural pressure is the pressure within the pleural space. This always has to stay negative. So this pressure here in the pleural cavity is always a negative pressure. If the pressure actually equals atmospheric pressure, that would actually cause lung collapse. And so I thought that this was a good picture to kind of explain this. And so during expiration, the diaphragm relaxes, external intercostals relax, the thoracic cavity gets smaller, putting more pressure on the lungs. So now we have a higher pressure in our lungs, and air is going to be expelled from the body. And so that's this part right here. We have a higher pressure in the lungs than in the atmosphere, and air leaves. At this point, you should be able to tell me how oxygen and carbon dioxide pass through the respiratory membrane. You should be able to tell me what dust cells are, those macrophages, what surfactant is and what its purpose is, what the 4 major events in breathing are. You should be able to tell me or define pulmonary ventilation, what the 2 phases of pulmonary ventilation are, what the prime mover of inspiration is, what do external intercostals do for breathing, what does the diaphragm do for breathing, how does pressure play a role in breathing, and is expiration an active or a passive process? I'm going to stop here and I will get the next video rolling in a little bit. Bye.